Okay, yeah. So as Paul said, we're going to carry on in a sermon series calling All Things New. And as we continue in this series, we're exploring what we call the kind of big story, the grand narrative of the scriptures, not as kind of a collection of disconnected stories, but really as a unified story that stretches from the opening words in the book of Genesis right through to that final vision that we see in the book of Revelation. As the theologian Albert Volta says, the Bible tells a single unified story of God dealing with the world. This story that we're looking at is marked by four distinct kind of movements or chapters, if you like, or acts of a play. Those four different movements are creation, rebellion, rescue, and renewal. Now, for the longest time, and if you've been around church for any length of time, often we focus our attention on those two central themes of the story, rebellion and rescue. And whilst they are true and they're important parts of the story, when we just focus on those two central parts, when we focus on them in isolation, it becomes like a truncated story or a bit of a half story. It's a bit like showing up to a film 20 or 30 minutes late. You know, you kind of get to the cinema and the film's already started and you're kind of like, what's going on? Because you've missed all those key kind of character forming moments, haven't you? You've missed all those moments where they lay out the details of what this story is about. Not only is it like going to a movie 20, 30 minutes late, but it's also like leaving 20 or 30 minutes before the end. That if you do that, you don't get to see what the conclusion is. You don't see the outcome of the story. And because of this tendency, and because we've often made God's story all about rebellion and rescue, we've reduced the story to this, what Dallas Willard calls the gospel of sin management, where essentially it's all about forgiveness of sin and then being warehoused in rooms like this until you die. That's kind of the gospel message that we have told. But actually, as we saw at the start of this series, God's story doesn't start with sin. Some of you are a little bit shocked by that. But God's story doesn't start with sin. It doesn't even start with you're a sinner. God's story starts with a God who creates. A God who creates and creation. And so God creates the universe and all that's in it. He creates humanity. And God said his creation was good. But like all good stories, there's often moments where disaster strikes. How many of us know that Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars film? And the reason why it's the best Star Wars film is because it's when it all goes wrong. Yeah. It's when disaster happens. It's when the good guys are on the back foot and it looks like the bad guys are winning. And it doesn't take long for disaster to strike in God's story. In fact, it's the third chapter of the first book of the Bible, where we see the goodness of creation and the harmony of humanity living in relationship with God and with one another is actually broken. Rebellion takes place. And this thing called sin enters into God's story. And so this is where the next movement in the story begins. Rebellion takes place, humankind and creation rebel and sin against God, and sin and brokenness and shame and destruction enter into our lived reality. And so it's at this point where we pick up today. And I guess the question is what's next? What could possibly happen next? If everything that was created in complete goodness, if all of creation that was good and harmonious, if humans were created in God's image to share in his creation, if that's where the story starts, and if we now discover that humanity has kind of messed that up, what could possibly happen next? And it's at this point of the story where we really have to lean into the fact that God is still in control, that God is still on the throne, he's still in control, and he's not done with creation. And it's at this point of the story where rescue begins. And so that's what we want to focus on today. Rescue begins. If you like, it's a time to reboot. Our first parents, Adam and Eve, have sinned and rebelled against God. Things have gone wrong, and God is looking to reboot his story. Now, what kind of reboot should God have? He could just think, oh, well, they've totally messed things up. Let's just start again. A bit like a superhero movie, where suddenly, it's like, oh, we don't like the direction that 15th movie in the trilogy of movies has got to. So we're just going to reboot. We're going to we're going to make a different actor Superman, and we're going to tell a slightly different story. God could have done that. He could have just screw it all up into a ball, and he could have just tossed it all into the bin and just started over again. But he doesn't. Instead, God looks at all his options and he chooses to redeem this story by going to look for a people. And in looking for a people, he actually chooses a person who is to represent generations of people who will live out the redemptive story of God. And so the very people that mess up the story, human beings, God goes back to them and he says, okay, come with me, and together we're going to clean up this mess. We're going to right the wrongs. Let's do this together. Let's rewrite the direction that this story is going in. And the first person that he chooses is this character in the Old Testament called Abraham. Now, we haven't got enough time to look deeply at the life of Abraham, but the headlines is this: when God calls Abraham, Abraham is like a pagan moon worshipper. Abraham doesn't even know who God is. And God says to him, you don't know me, but Abraham, I know you. I know who you are. And I want you to trust me. And I want you to go to the place I will show you. And so God calls Abraham. And Abraham begins to cooperate with God. We see God makes a series of promises to Abraham. And it's and some of them are kind of mind-blowing things. If God said these things to me, my mind would be blown away. But the fascinating thing is, in Genesis chapter 3, there are 5 curses that God issues as a result of human rebellion. And in Genesis chapter 12, when God is blessing Abraham, he blesses him with 5 blessings. And, I might be oversimplifying this a little bit, but it's almost as if God was saying, for every broken part that entered into the story, I am going to bless you in return. That God is undoing the effects of what was broken. And so in many ways, God was saying to them, every time you walked away from me as people, I'm going to restore you back to the place where you belong. And so these blessings keep coming. In the book, The Drama of Scripture, it says this about blessings and curses. It says the dynamic word bless expresses God's purpose to give his creatures all they need to fulfill their lives in his creation as he intended for them. The word curse, by contrast, expresses God's awful judgment on his creatures when they rebel against his purposes for them. And you see, that's what we see taking place. First in the life of Abraham, but then that transfers to all of humanity as God begins to reverse the effects of rebellion. He starts with Abraham and he extends it to all. And as we see this process take place, we see it happen through this strange concept in the Bible referred to as covenant. We don't have anything equal in our culture that kind of equals what covenant is. I guess the closest thing that we have is marriage. So if you've got a Bible, why don't you turn to Genesis chapter 15? And this is where we see this covenant taking place. Now, we don't have enough time to kind of go through all the details, but as we read it together, what we see is that Abraham has he's received these promises from God. The promises that ultimately he's going to have a child, despite the fact that him and his wife Sarah are unable to conceive. They're going to have a child and their descendants are going to outnumber the stars in the sky. And Abraham has this tendency, because this promise hasn't been fulfilled, whenever he meets with God after this point, he's constantly reminding God, do you remember the promise you made? Do you remember what's meant to happen? Well, it hasn't happened yet. And it's at this moment we're going to pick up. Abraham has once again said to God, you haven't fulfilled what you promised yet. And God says this to him. So verse 5 of Genesis 15, it says, he, meaning God, took him outside, him, meaning Abraham, took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And so God restates his promise to Abraham that he is going to be the father of nations. And then it said, Abraham, because his name is not been changed yet, it says, Abraham believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? The Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. And now here's the interesting thing. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mastered there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sins of the Amorites have not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give you this land. And so a covenant is a agreement that cannot be broken. And as we see in Genesis 15, it really happened in a kind of bloody and kind of gruesome, slightly disturbing kind of way. It's kind of a little bit more significant than just a handshake or, a gentleman's agreement. And basically, what's happening is they take these animals, some goats and cows and doves, and they cut them in half. There's a picture on the screen that kind of illustrates this. They cut them in half and they place them each side by side, creating like this kind of bloody pathway. And it's just wide enough. The pathway is just wide enough for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder. Okay, so imagine two people walking shoulder to shoulder between these dead animals. Okay, and as you are walking this pathway of covenant, you're saying to each other, if one of us breaks this agreement, we will end up like those animals on the floor. That's essentially what you're saying here. There's a reference to this in Jeremiah 34, verses 18 and 19, if you don't believe me. And so the idea of covenant is kind of slightly strange, isn't it, to our 21st century ears? It's a strange concept, but it kind of feels like it's a big deal at the same time. So it's kind of strange for us to fully understand, but it kind of feels like it's a big deal. And so here's what's happening in Genesis 15. And so the promise God makes to Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land and they will outnumber the stars in the sky. This covenant is really where God's rescue mission starts. It's where the rescue starts in God's story. And what we see in this particular story is God does something fairly unique. Abraham sets out the animals ready for the covenant, but then God makes Abraham fall asleep. And God himself takes the covenant alone. He walks the path by himself. In nearly all other covenants in the scriptures, it's a two-person deal. And neither of those people can break that covenant. But because the stakes are so high, because the future hope of humanity is riding on this promise being kept, because it's key to God's rescue mission, it's so important that God takes both sides of the deal. It's like he's saying, I've got this one covered. I've got this covenant covered. God is so committed to removing what is broken that he's willing to take the whole deal on himself. Sound familiar to something that happens a few thousand years later? God is willing to take this on himself. Maybe we've never seen the significance of that before if we've read this passage. And the idea of covenant is like this. It's like God is saying, I will be to you as I should be, whether you are or are not as you should be to me. And you see, that is what God has done with Abraham. On this day, when he's made Abraham fall asleep, he's walked the path alone. And he's saying, I will be to you as I will always be, regardless of what you do, regardless of how you perform, regardless of how faithful you may remain. I'm in this. It's my commitment to make. That's how committed God is to reversing the effects of rebellion. And that's what we see happen throughout the Old Testament as God's ongoing commitment to redeem and restore what was broken in the garden, to bring back all that was destroyed through human rebellion. And you see, that's the grand narrative, isn't it? That's the big story. That's where God's rescue mission begins. He invites us into a covenant that he takes himself. He takes the full consequences of that covenant. And that's why he never gives up. And, as we journey through the rest of the Old Testament, we see that that's God's commitment. It's God's commitment to Abraham. It's God's commitment to his descendants. It's God's commitment to Israel. No matter how much they rebel against him, no matter how much they turn their back on him, God is constantly calling them back, constantly keeps his promise. He doesn't give up on them. And the great news is he doesn't give up on you. He doesn't give up on me. That's wonderful news. What does this tell us? It tells us that all of us have a much bigger role in God's story than just being saved. That it's not just about being saved from something, but it's about we're saved because God is redeeming the rest of the world through his people. The evangelist Christine Caine says, God uses rescued people to rescue people. You see, it's a covenant of purpose with the expected purpose of reversing the effects of brokenness and rebellion. That's the story of the scriptures. That's the story that you and I are caught up in. That's the story that we wake up in every single day. This is where the rescue mission of God begins. God himself is fully committed to our rescue, fully committed to reversing all that's been broken. Let me illustrate this through a story. Some of you may remember there was an earthquake in Armenia in 1989. Some of you weren't even born, but there was an earthquake in Armenia in 1989. It measured at 8.2 on the Richter scale. And in 4 minutes, it was estimated that around 30,000 people lost their lives. That morning, a father had dropped his son at school. His son was called Ahmed. He dropped his son off at school, and like he told his son every single day, he said to him, remember, no matter what, I'm always here for you. You see, this was a promise that his father made to his son every day. This was almost like a covenant that his father made with his son every single day. I will always be there for you. And as he walked away, leaving his son at school, the earthquake hit. And the first thing the father did was he thought about the promise that he'd made his son. So he rushed back to where the school was, and to his dismay, there was just piles of rubble. And people were standing around, grieving and overcome with what had happened. And for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He'd suddenly, as the reality of what had happened had dawned on him. And then in the midst of grief, he began to run towards the place where he thought his son's classroom would have been. And when he got there, there was just piles of rubble. And so he begins to dig with his bare hands, picking up chunks of plaster and concrete. People come by and say, what are you doing? It's no use. They're all gone. But he says, I promised my son I won't give up. I promised my son I would be there. And so he continues for 2 hours, and 2 hours become 4 hours, and 4 hours become 8, and 10 hours, and then 10 hours become 20. And 28 hours, he's thinking, should I give up? But then he thinks, what if my son is still alive? And then just after the 38th hour, he hears a muffled voice beneath the rubble. And this voice says, Papa, Papa. And he digs and he finds his son. And not only does he find his son, but he finds 33 others from his son's class. And as the children come out, he hears his son turn to his friend and says, see, I told you, if my father was alive, he would come for us. If there was one thing God would have us hear this morning through the story of covenant, through the story of Abraham, it's this: no matter what, I'll always be here for you. And no matter how dark, how desperate, how broken, how painful things become, he will always be there. He will always come back for those who need rescuing. That's the promise he made. He would always come back for those who need rescuing. Next time, we're going to look at Jesus and how Jesus, in Jesus, God puts on flesh and he embodies his rescue mission to the world. But for now, let's remember, we're not standing in the rubble wondering if God has given up. We're actually standing at the moment where rescue begins. That's where we are in God's big story. You see, the God of creation did not abandon the world when rebellion entered it. He did not walk away when humanity broke trust. He did not start over with a clean slate and erase us from his story. Instead, he stepped closer. He made promises he knew would cost him everything. He walked the covenant path alone. He bound himself to a broken people because his heart was always set towards restoration. And that means our failure doesn't cancel God's faithfulness. Our weakness does not nullify his promises. Our brokenness does not disqualify us from his purposes. You see, the same God that turned to Abraham and said, I will be faithful even when you are not, is the same God who says to us today, no matter what, I'll always be here for you. No matter what, I'll always be there. And you see, this is not just a story about being forgiven, but it's a story about being caught up in God's rescue mission. A story where rescued people become part of God's rescued plan. And so next time, we'll see how this covenant story reaches its breakthrough climax in Jesus. When God doesn't just make a promise, but he keeps it by stepping into human history, putting on flesh. But today, let's the truth of what we've heard just settle in our hearts. God isn't finished. God hasn't walked away. And God is still rescuing people. He's still restoring people. He's still drawing people back to himself. And he's still making all things new. Amen? Amen. Why don't we stand together?